Hi guys, my name's Adam and welcome to my new video. Firstly, I would like to thank all of you for watching, and if you like this video, you can give it a thumbs up, it helps me a lot. Also consider subscribing for more videos like this. But let's get to the main event. Today we're gonna take a road down the memory lane once again, and we're gonna have a look at this legendary device, and that's the first generation Apple iPad. This device was released in April of 2010, so it is celebrating 10 years now. This iPad has quickly become the fastest selling consumer product in history, and it started the whole tablet revolution. But how is this 10-year-old device holding up today? Can you actually find any use for this device here in 2020? Or is it totally obsolete and has only value for collectors? Let's find out with me. Here we go. Like I said, this device is celebrating 10 years now, and you can tell it's not the most recent model when you look at it. In 2010, this was the state-of-the-art technology, and it looks good even today. The design is fairly outdated by now, but it doesn't mean that it's still not gorgeous. Apple usually uses the same design of their products for several generations, but this iPad was quite unique because it's the only model with this particular design, as the iPad 2 a year later was completely redesigned. On the front side, you can see the 9.7-inch LCD panel with a huge bezels around the screen. Well, at least for today's standard. Under the screen there's a home button, on the top you have a power button, and on the right side there's a volume buttons and a traditional mute switch. Like all the iPads, this one is also made from the aluminum on the back with the Apple logo and the iPad branded. This original iPad is quite thick, even though Apple did try to cover it up with this rounded design, but at its thickest point it is almost 1.3 centimeters. Overall, this design is one of the most iconic ones, but in 2020 it definitely shows its age. The original iPad has 9.7-inch LCD screen, and Apple kept the screen size in their cheapest iPads up to 2018. The resolution of this screen is 1024 by 768, which is quite low and no Retina screen at all. You can clearly see individual pixels when you look up close. But you have to remember that this model was released even before the iPhone 4 was introduced, which was the first Apple product to feature the high-resolution Retina screen. And although the resolution is not good by today's standard, the overall screen quality is not that bad. The colors are pretty nice, the viewing angles are good, and it definitely is usable if you can get used to the lower resolution. Of course, this screen supports the multi-touch technology, which is obviously nothing special today, but it was one of the main selling points of this device in 2010. Of course, it lacks all these display perks the newer iPads have, such as True Tone, higher refresh rate, night shift, support for Apple Pencil and more, but that's to be expected with this third generation model. Hardware and performance of this iPad is probably the area where you can tell for sure that this device is old. The first generation iPad was the first device ever which came with Apple's custom system on a chip. In this model, it was the single-core A4 CPU clocked at 1 GHz and 256 MB of RAM, which is honestly crazy to see this low amount of RAM when today's iPhones have almost 20 times more memory. And I always wondered why Apple didn't use 512 MB of RAM in this iPad, because they did use 512 megabytes in combination with the A4 CPU just a few months later in the iPhone 4, and this iPhone was supported up to iOS 7, which is a lot newer iOS version than the latest one for this iPad, but more about it later. At 2010, the performance of this iPad was nothing to complain about, it was just fine. But at that time, apps were nowhere as complex as they are today, and there was little to none multitasking, and even functionality of the iOS was much more limited than today, so you didn't need that much power. But Apple definitely didn't future-proof this iPad in terms of hardware. As time went by, apps became more demanding, iOS was getting a lot more functionality, and this iPad was not able to catch up with that. So when I use it today, it kind of feels sluggish and sometimes just painfully slow. It's not that visible with the pre-installed apps, because these are always perfectly optimized for the device, but almost every third-party app is slow on this iPad. And these are not current versions, because this device obviously cannot run the latest software, but even those old apps are slow on this one. And don't let me start about web browsing, because this is not a good experience on this iPad. As newer websites require much more RAM, and one tab can take up to 1 GB now, it's obvious that this one cannot handle it. I have Safari and Chrome here, and both of these are very slow. But even though these are at least 6 or 7 years old versions of these browsers, they are usually able to load majority of websites, but you can take a shower or make yourself a coffee before the loading is over. When it comes to gaming, this tablet pleasantly surprised me. Of course, like I said, you are not able to install any game newer than like 2013, but you are able to download few old versions of games from the App Store, and these run mostly fine on this device. But bear in mind that this iPad can run only the simplest of games, nothing too graphically demanding of course. With every single iPad in the past 10 years, Apple has declared 10 hours of battery life. And even though some iPads had better and some little bit worse battery than this claim, it usually averages around these 10 hours. This iPad has 6600 mAh battery, and to my surprise this battery holds up fantastically even though it's never been replaced in this particular model. So it's 9 or 10 years old at this point. I'm not using this tablet on a daily basis as it's more of a collector's item for me, but I charge it usually once every 3 or 4 months just to keep the battery going. And I've been playing with this iPad for the past few days just for the purpose of making this video, and the battery life really shocked me. It is still able to get through the whole day, and in some cases it even seemed that the battery in this is actually better than the one in my 11-inch 2018 iPad Pro. But of course I do much more demanding tasks on the Pro, so it's not a fair comparison. But yeah, the battery is really incredible even after all these years. When it comes to connectivity, this iPad features the old 30-pin connector, which is something you don't see in Apple products today as Lightning took over many years ago. The downside of this connector is the fact that there is not a lot of accessories to buy today as everyone is focusing only on the newer models. And yeah, you also get a 3.5mm headphone jack at the top, which is also a rare thing to see at Apple product here in 2020. As for wireless connectivity, there's of course Wi-Fi and Bluetooth 2.1, so you can connect it for example to a wireless keyboard if you need to. Obviously, Apple did not make the keyboard case for this first generation model like they do today, but you can hook it up to the standard Magic Keyboard from your Mac. This iPad was also made in a 3G version, and that one had a little plastic cutout on the aluminum back for the antennas. The first generation iPad was made in 16, 32 and 64 GB. I always say that you should avoid the 16 GB versions of any Apple product, but in this case it's a little bit different. You know, the original iPad was made in 2010 and apps back then were tiny compared to today. You see, Chrome is only like 50 megabytes and YouTube is 17 megabytes. Can you believe it? Today, apps like this are 3, 4 or even 500 megabytes in size. And keep in mind that you cannot install a lot of apps to this device because no one is supporting the original iPad anymore. And this thing also doesn't have camera, so you can't take pictures on it, and you probably will only use cloud services to see your pictures and videos. So in this case, 16 GB is just enough in my opinion. First generation iPad originally shipped with the iPadOS 3.2 pre-installed. Yes, you heard right, iPadOS. With the version 4.0, Apple renamed it to the iOS, and this particular device only got 2 major upgrades of the system, which is pretty amazing in the Android world, but in the Apple ecosystem, it's one of the, if not the worst supported device in Apple's modern history. It received update to iOS 4 and later to the iOS 5, so the latest version this iPad can run is the iOS 5.1.1 from the May of 2012, so it only got 2 years of software support. I honestly don't understand why Apple didn't support this iPad with the iOS 6, even though they released iOS 6 for the iPhone 3GS, which featured even less powerful CPU and the same 256 MB of RAM as this iPad. Of course, iOS 7 and newer would be a disaster for this device, but iOS 6 runs quite well on the 3GS, so I think they could release it for the original iPad and make it a little more usable. With the iOS 5, you get this old retro iOS look with the skeuomorphism all around the OS and these old school animations. It looks totally outdated in 2020, but I have to say I always loved this UI because it looked so different from everything else on the market, and I hope Apple will come back to this in the future, of course with much more modern version of this design. That would be so cool to see. So right now we have a pretty good idea about the hardware specs and software of this original iPad. So the obvious question is, what can you use this tablet for in 2020? I tried using it for a while to find out what this device is able to do. Well, you can browse the web, but like I said, it's not a pleasant experience at all, and some websites won't even load. You can use iMessage, which seems to be still working, obviously without all these newer features of course, but for text messaging, it works fine. You can use Maps, and these are the original Google Maps, not the newer Apple Maps, and they're still up to date, so you can use it as a simple navigation in your car maybe. Email still works, so you can send and receive emails, even though there's a problem with the attachments, as this iPad cannot open many types of files. Music also still works, even though this doesn't support Apple Music, but you can load songs from your computer and use it as a giant iPod, for example. But for me, there's only one reasonable use for this iPad, and that's a device for kids. The older version of VLC player still works, so you can load it with movies or videos for kids and let them use this device to pass time in car or during long travel, for example. Unfortunately, YouTube doesn't work anymore as the app lost support and cannot load any content. And I tried it in a web browser and it loaded a page, but I was not able to play any video. So you are only able to load your own videos to the VLC player. And from the App Store you can download all versions of some kids games, so for young children this can be a good device, because you don't have to worry that they will sneak behind your back to use social media like Facebook or Instagram, simply because this doesn't work anymore on this tablet. But aside of the use case I just described, there's not much you can do with this iPad. I own it for 3 years and I bought it for like $30, simply to put it to my collection of Apple products. I don't recommend you to buy this iPad in 2020, but if you have, for example, one lying around, you can still use it somehow, even if you used it only as a digital photo frame, which is also something you can use the original iPad for in 2020. So, how's the original iPad holding up today? Well, not good to be honest. This was one of the most revolutionary devices 10 years ago, but today there's a very little you can actually do with it. It definitely has the first generation curse that almost all Apple devices have. I mean, Apple always comes up with some mind-blowing, completely game-changing products, but the first generations of these are usually like prototypes to test the waters, and they all have few things in common. They are very limited in functionality, they are not very powerful, and they lose software support much sooner than their successors. It was the case with the original iPhone, with the first Apple Watch, or even with the first generation MacBook Air. A year later, Apple released iPad 2, and this one was actually supported up to iOS 9, which is 4 more versions than this original iPad. So this device will always be legendary and quite rare, because it was on sale for less than a year. But other than to add it to your collection, there's no reason to buy one today. So guys, that's it for today's video. What do you think about the original iPad? Do you still have one? Is there some use case of this tablet I forgot to mention? Let me know in the comment section down below, and don't forget to give me a thumbs up if you like this video and subscribe for more. I have many Apple related videos like this on my channel, so give it a shot and have a look. But until the next time, have a great day, stay safe, stay healthy, stay home if possible, and see you in the next video. Bye!